Welcome to the AI and Faith podcast. We are a community of expert technologists, professionals, and faith leaders bringing the ancient wisdom of the world's major religions to the ethics of artificial intelligence. Join us on this new journey and welcome to the conversation.
We just have to have some guardrails, and without them you can already see how those who are powerful, those who create the algorithms, those who have access to big tech companies, have access to our data, they can just completely consistently reinforcing their power. Without some kind of guardrails on that could become really problematic, even more problematic than it is now.
My name is Alex Sarkissian, and I'll be your host for today's episode, which features a recent conversation that I had with Dr. Jane Compson. Jane is an associate professor of comparative religion and ethics at the University of Washington-Tacoma and a member of the AI and Faith research team. Jane brings a unique perspective. She's both a practicing Buddhist, trained chaplain, and scholar focused on the application of Buddhist insights and contemplative practices in contemporary contexts such as higher education, climate, and healthcare. We discussed how Buddhist concepts like impermanence and not self offer valuable frameworks for thinking about AI development, the notion of AI as a karmic accelerator, how AI is transforming Jane's role as a professor, the ethics of care bots in healthcare and end of life, and how we might approach all these challenges with greater wisdom and compassion. And now to our conversation. Hi, Jane. Thanks so much for being here.
Hi, Alex. Thank you so much for having me.
Giving you an introduction, just in your own words, if you could give folks a sense for what you do, summarize your work and what you're thinking about and what you're interested in.
I am an academic. I am associate professor at the University of Washington in Tacoma, out here in the Pacific Northwest. And my areas of interest are religious studies and philosophy. And specifically, I teach Buddhism, comparative religion, kind of applied philosophy, like I teach a class on philosophy, religion and the environment. Sometimes I teach environmental ethics or just general ethics or medical ethics. So I'm kind of interested in religious studies in a contemporary context, kind of where it overlaps with secular world or ethics generally. And so over just kind of by accident, you know how these things happen, I've ended up recently getting increasingly involved with conversations about artificial intelligence and Buddhism and ethics and how not just Buddhist voices, but how voices from religious traditions, spiritual traditions can contribute to conversations about the future of AI, what it means, things like what it means to be human, what is the good, what do we imagine AI to look like, how can we make it like that, who decides? And so every week, every day, every hour, actually, new questions come up and new technologies come up. It's bewildering and hard to keep on top of. But at the same time, it seems a really important thing to keep an eye on, or to be involved in, because I really do think it's going to change the landscape of just what it means for us as humans to be in the world. Potentially could bring wonderful things, and it potentially also could be a serious existential threat. So, you know, this seems like a really important point in our history that could be a kind of tipping point one way or the other. So that's a little bit. And I also kind of like one other thing is that I'm interested in academic and research, but I'm also practicing Buddhist. I'm a Buddhist chaplain, and I don't do that actively because I'm an academic now, but I am really interested in the application of kind of contemplative practices in secular spaces. So I often do meditation or contemplative practices in my academic classroom as kind of part of the curriculum, and I'm interested in looking at different ways of knowing and why we use them in academia and why we don't, and all those kind of things. So I'm sort of bringing that interest too into my work with AI, like not just what do we do with AI, like academically, but how should we be in the world and how do we cope with the kind of existential angst and anxiety that can, I think for anybody who starts really learning about AI and what it can do, what it's going to be able to do, it poses some deeply kind of unsettling questions about that, who we are, who we're going to be, all that kind of stuff.
It's lovely. It's fascinating, and so many mutual interests. Would love to hear a little bit more about how you came to Buddhism, and then maybe from there into the technology AI space.
Yeah, thanks. So Buddhism, I grew up in the UK and I grew up in a little village, rather idyllic, kind of is actually where Winnie the Pooh is set. And
The
it is kind of entirely.
Thousand Acre Woods?
Yeah, you can walk to there from my house. So, it was kind of entirely as idyllic as it sounds, and we had a little village and a church. And so I grew up in a Church of England, which, Americans would call Episcopal Church. And it was all very lovely and it's a lovely community. But as I got older, I just was like, I really had a hard time with the kind of theology, especially when I started studying more. And then I went to university and started studying philosophy of religion. And I'm like, oh man, I really found myself having to do these kind of metaphysical contortions to try and make it work or make sense for me. And then I happened to go to a class on just a little one sample class on Buddhism. And I'm like, oh, okay, now makes more sense to me. So I learned more about that. And then it felt like, I guess, just much more at home in that teaching tradition. And not that I don't mean in any way to disparage any other tradition, but for me, it was, I didn't have to do those gymnastics anymore to make it make sense. It was just, it really gelled with my own experience. Particularly, I felt the idea of faith as being something you built up from experience rather than faith in something that must exist despite the evidence. It was more, I don't know, empirical or something. I've subsequently realized that that's all part of a tradition of kind of Buddhist modernism that I'd become kind of unwittingly swept up in. But nevertheless, it did feel like a more comfortable path for me. So that's how I got into that. Then I did my PhD in comparative religion, Buddhism and Christianity. And then my teacher, one of my supervisors for that, was also a practicing Buddhist and taught me meditation, Rupert Gethin. And so I became quite interested in meditation too. And from there, I got into retreats and things. And from there, I wanted to bring that into my teaching and decided that it could be problematic to be teaching as a Buddhist practitioner in, a secular classroom. I could see that could be problematic in many different ways, although there's lots of conversations we could have about that as a sidebar. So I got really interested in mindfulness as like a secular field and contemplative education as a secular field. So then I got trained up in that. So I'm a trained teacher in MBSR, mindfulness-based stress reduction, and compassion cultivation training. And soon after that, I took chaplaincy training through Upaya Zen Center, which is within the Buddhist tradition, but it takes very seriously kind of ecumenical approach, and did a lot of work on a lot of our trainings to do with kind of trauma and trauma resilience and social justice, things that are not kind of Buddhist specific. So I found those really helpful kind of practical and spiritual tools for bringing into a kind of my non-spiritual, but still all my spiritual life, but you know what I mean, into the kind of my work life and professional life. And so I've always kind of enjoyed trying to keep those integrated rather than siloed. I think you also asked about the tech, how I got into the AI thing. That was just a complete accident. I got to tell you, I'm more surprised than anybody that I ended up in this space. I'm not really a techie. I mean, like anybody else, I got the cell phones and things like that, but I certainly don't have any kind of technical knowledge about programming or anything like that. It was basically a colleague who told me about this group that had just started in Seattle called Artificial Intelligence and Faith, which of course we all know about because this is what this podcast is for. And at that point, it was very new. I can't remember what year it was. It's probably 5 or 6 years ago, maybe something like that. And they had quite a lot of people representing theistic traditions, but very few Buddhist folks. And so my colleague said, would you be interested? I'm like, wow, just know absolutely nothing about that. I'd hardly even heard of artificial intelligence. But, I thought, well, okay, let's have a look. And so I went along to a few conferences or, watched some of the talks. And I'm like, oh, okay, this is actually really interesting. And of course, over the last few years, as AI has gathered momentum, you can't really avoid the topic now. And the AI and faith community has grown hugely. And I think, props to the board and to the organization. They've really done a great job of engaging us all in conversation with each other. It's been a really exciting community to work in, such a broad range of issues, questions, and so many like interesting, lively minds talking about this, and big hearts and big spirits. So that's really been an unexpected delight. Also, I don't know if others feel like this too in this field, but I do feel, imposter syndrome is pretty out there. It's pretty a big thing in academia anyway. But with AI and faith, I mean, my goodness, it's like for me, it's like the ultra test of avoid trying to fend off imposter syndrome, because there's so much to know. So much of it is a black box. I don't have the technical expertise, and it's growing so quickly. Right, it's like you just can't possibly keep up on top of it all. But then I get together with people in community and we start just kind of spitballing and talking about things, and then you realize, wow, yeah, this is actually part of what's so important about this community, is that we are all in this space of not knowing, and that's a really important thing to acknowledge and I think, and to kind of have solidarity working through that, rather than feeling like you have to get it figured out before you can join the conversation. So I think very few of us would think that we have got it figured out at this point.
Yeah, I'd be concerned if anyone felt like they did.
Yeah.
Yeah. And just on that, resonating with a core Buddhist teaching on impermanence and uncertainty, and how not knowing is most intimate, and how this perspective really important in so many ways, in so many aspects of life, but in particular around this topic of AI and this moment that we're in. There's so much uncertainty. And it's one way in which I think Buddhism offers a helpful frame, helpful lens for engaging the topic. And I'm curious how else you feel Buddhism in particular contributes to this dialogue around AI and the ethics of how we develop this technology and engage with it.
That's a great question. And I think you nailed it when you said, one of the things is that idea of Buddhism is how to deal with suffering, right? And one of the many forms that suffering takes is this kind of existential angst and uncertainty, of which AI provides plenty. In fact, there are 3 types of suffering. Buddhism talks about ordinary suffering, suffering from change, and suffering from conditions. And like the suffering from conditions is kind of like, if you like, the rules of the game of existence. Like we're born into this existence where everything is impermanent, and where pain is inevitable, suffering is inevitable, and we kind of don't really know what we're doing here or what we're meant to do here, and sort of all of those questions. And that happens, anyway in life without AI. But I think the new reality that is emerging with AI really heightens some of those questions. What kind of a world is that going to be? And also the question of change, of course, like AI is changing things so quickly in so many domains. I even noticed that in my teaching, right? I've been teaching academia for like 20 years or so. And I would say in the last year, probably, AI has really started to like visibly come into my teaching life. And it has really made me think, and I'm still really in the midst of grappling with this, like, what does it mean to be a professor now? Because I use it a lot. I use it a lot to help me with things. Like in the old days, if I wanted to find out about, there's which sutta in the Pali Canon talks about 3 types of suffering, for example. I'd have had to go to the library, and in my day, would look at the microfiche, and if I was lucky, we had a computer, and then I'd have to go and get the books. And now I just go to Google, ask the question in 10 seconds. I've got the answer, and I've got a link to the translation. I've got the Pali, the original Pali version, right? So things like that, it's incredibly helpful. It can increase my productivity, but that also creates a huge amount of, I would say, work kind of pressure, because there are so many, in the old days I could say, oh, well, this is a good question to pursue, but oh, look, the library's closed. Now I won't be able to look at it. It kind of built in boundaries. But now there are kind of no boundaries. And every single question I think about, I have another question in my mind, like, oh, I wonder if that translation is, everyone agrees with that translation of this word. And then, you can delve into that question. So it can just be this endless wormhole, and then you kind of get lost in that. There's that. And then at the same time, there's my cell phone sitting right there, and another app on my computer, and they're all competing for my attention and my ability to resist those temptations that pull for my attention, I feel is getting weaker and weaker as the algorithms get better and better at knowing what is going to be appealing to me. So then there's this existential kind of angst about, I know that looking at this 17th reel is not going to bring me satisfaction. It's not going to help me with this project that I'm trying to do. And yet I find myself looking at it anyway, right? And so it's kind of distracting in my work. It's helpful in my work. Sometimes I will write something and then I run it through AI for an edit. And increasingly now I look at AI as what it produces and I think, yeah, that's a really great edit. It's better than I could have done. And then I begin to feel like this thing is better than me at lots of these things. Kind of what's the point of me, as an instructor? This could probably plan my class much better than I could. How do I compete with, I think the days of just standing in front of a class and lecturing as a talking head are just completely gone, because I'm basically competing with TikToks and Reels that are able to communicate in much more engaging ways. And I'm also trying to compete in the attention economy for students who increasingly were brought up in the digital era and have become habituated to these short little bursts of information and simply don't have the attentional bandwidth for long periods of attention. And I find my own attention ability eroding, actually, the more as I use these tools. Yeah, it's scary, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. And my memory today is noticeably worse than it was just a few years ago.
Really?
Oh, for sure. For sure. And I keep hearing this.
Huh.
Who knows, right? But I can't help but think, yeah, these technologies and the way that we're engaging them. I mean, I think there were studies that came out quite a while ago now that just showed search engines, we're using search engines as a way to essentially offload our memory, sort of outsource our memory, which I see myself doing. I see like, oh, I don't need to encode this experience as a memory as maybe as strongly as I would have, because, well, like I have a photo of it that I can just scroll up in my phone and sort of see, or I don't have to remember what my friend sent to me last week. I can just scroll up and see what he texted me, and I don't need to remember this fact. It's I can just Google it. And so I think we're conditioning our minds for sure towards outsourcing capacities that technology apparently can do as well, though who really knows, right?
Yeah. I mean,
who really knows what the impacts are downstream?
Yeah, right. It's so early. I mean, I've started to kind of feel like in my writing and even somewhat in my teaching, like, whereas before, like maybe I was like, if you use the analogy of an orchestra, I was playing the violin, or I was like, playing the cello. Now, like, I feel like my role is more as a conductor. I get AI to do those bits of work. And my role as an expert is to see whether that they played those bars well and it fit in with everything else. And for that part, I think I still do have advantage over AI in that, in order to evaluate whether AI is doing the job well, I do have some knowledge that I can check it against. But I feel like if I were learning a new area, and this is why I have to be so careful about using AI to teach me about AI and how AI works. I haven't been trained with like a BS monitor for it, right? I don't know whether what it's telling me is good or not. Whereas with the stuff about Buddhist traditions, to a certain extent, I can say, yeah, I can see where you're getting at, but not quite, right? But when that goes, what happens, So I'm feeling that definitely with teaching. I'm feeling that with when I'm teaching my students, like, what's it going to mean to be a student? Because we have this, I'm sure any teacher is having to grapple with this now, like any university or school. What policies do we have around using AI, around allowing students to use AI? And I tend to be in the kind of more liberal side, if that's the right word, but I think that students should be able to use it. I don't,
I agree.
Because if they don't use it, they're going to be behind. Everyone's starting to use it now. But what are the skill sets? So they lose their ability to perhaps to write well themselves, but they might not need to write well themselves in the future. So what's the uniquely human contribution that they can bring that AI can't? How do we identify that, and how do we train them in that, right? That's what I'm thinking about contemplative traditions and things like that. Like, values compassion, because AI basically kind of, at the moment at least, is just sort of a statistical machine that just produces based on what we put into it. Itself is morally neutral, just reflects what we give it. So I would want to think the virtues, whichever tradition you want to use, but for Buddhism, wisdom, compassion, generosity, those kind of things, that's what humans can do at the moment that AI can't. And even when I say it can't, it can perform, like you can have AI perform a compassionate action in a sense, like AI bots in healthcare, for example, can have a script that sounds very compassionate. So in that sense, they could be compassionate. But right now, I don't think there's a there that's not a compassionate being that you're talking to, right? But then some people think that's going to change pretty quickly. That's another thing you asked about, what Buddhism can bring to it, this discussion. I think another way that Buddhism is kind of well placed for this discussion is because of its views or philosophy about the self, or rather than not self, right? The sense that our feeling of self is an aggregation of lots of different elements that come together sort of adventitiously in this particular pattern, but there's no fixed core or entity. I'm imagining, I'm comparing this, and I hope I'm representing this fairly. I'm comparing this with other traditions that have an idea of a soul that is fixed and is sort of like divine or created by God, and God knows that unique soul. And I can see that with AI conversations, that would become really problematic and difficult to even know how to have a conversation about, well, can AI have a soul, or all that kind of thing. With Buddhism, it's like, human brains are basically work on this network. We're networks, carbon-based, right? Now, AI is basically, its mind is working on silicon-based. And I'm getting a lot of this from Peter Hershock, who I know you've also interviewed. Silicon-based networks. And frankly, we don't really understand how the sense of ourselves or of having a mind, we don't really know how mind comes from the brain, networks in the brain, but it's an emergent property. Well, if we have really sophisticated silicon-based networks, who's to say that they can also have this mysterious emergent property? We just don't know, right? So I think for Buddhism, it's easier to think, okay, this is a kind of legitimate conversation. It's not preposterous. It's not something we should just dismiss. Like, let's talk about this. Things change, things evolve. Let's talk about this. That's another way I think that it's kind of fertile ground for this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's the idea of what wisdom and compassion really are if there's no consciousness, right?
Yeah.
And we're thinking about, how can we program wisdom and compassion and care into these technologies? And to some degree, as you suggested, we can simulate it. Maybe we can simulate it quite well, but if there is no consciousness there, is there real capacity for awakening, awakening action, awakening activity, which, from some Buddhist perspectives, there are no enlightened beings, right? There's just enlightened activity.
Yeah.
And so, what does that mean in the context of entities that are maybe not conscious?
Yeah, exactly. And I think, I've talked about this with Peter Hershock and another collaborator in the Buddhist side of AIF. I don't know if you've met her yet, Nikki Mogafori.
Yes, I do know Nikki.
Oh, she's wonderful too. And
she
so
is.
we get together with those two and Mark Graves, and we had these I just really enjoy chatting about these things. And we talked about this quite a lot. And one of, Peter talks about AI as kind of being a karmic accelerator, right?
Yep.
Whatever you put in, it spins it out.
And then some.
Yeah, it spins it out and then some. Which, is, if you sort of think that as like a wheel of life, that's just the nature of the way things work, right? Mind kind of builds into next mind moments. It's just that this is a force multiplier for that. But the same processes still stand, right? If we can make the deepest motivation of that generosity or wisdom, loving kindness, as opposed to greed, hatred, and ignorance, well, then that AI will spin that up. In a way, it's kind of neutral as a mechanism. It's how we program it. And, maybe AI, I'm thinking about, we've been talking recently in our little group about care bots in healthcare, right? And they're already out there in the market and working, robots who work with people in nursing homes, particularly people who have dementia. And, as you know, with dementia, sometimes people get really disorientated in like sort of time and history, and they keep asking the same questions again and again and again. And it might be really difficult, like somebody who forgets that their spouse of 50 years died last year and like keeps talking as though they're still alive. And then, the family member who's looking after them has to keep telling them again and again, I'm sorry, he passed away, and go through that trauma every single time. Well, an AI bot doesn't get compassion fatigue in the sense that it can keep answering that question kindly if the person who's receiving that information is not feeling kind of discouraged by the fact it's a bot telling them that rather than a family member or a human. Well, it's an act of kindness, right? And it's also an act of kindness in the sense that it's sparing the family member or the helper who only has a limited amount of emotional bandwidth to do that. So it's not necessarily all bad, but there's still kind of an ick factor.
And it's always a question of how much, and what context and what's the intention, right? Like, in that scenario, skillful application of technology, perhaps, but when it's coming from a different intention, say unwillingness to engage in the emotional friction of having to be with a loved one who's suffering and all that comes with that, which understandably is difficult. But when we start just hitting the escape button on all of those opportunities that come our way, then are we losing our capacity to actually like cultivate and express these qualities of care and compassion, right? In the same way that we're losing the ability to remember things or how to write. Like what happens when we lose the capacity to care?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And just as we come to a close here, I'm curious how you think about applied ethics in the context of AI development and how we can shape culture upstream to some degree around how these technologies are coming into being such that they ideally are less problematic once we're engaging with them.
That's a huge question. And that's one that I'm really grappling with. I feel like right now I'm like at the first noble truth stage of like identifying, hey, there's really a problem here. And I haven't really got to like, what's the eightfold path? Like, what do we do about it? I mean, I do think that Peter Hersholt talks about this idea of like an ecosystem ethics, which I really like that idea. Like a healthy ecosystem has a diversity of species. And in the same way, like a sound ethical system should have a diversity of perspectives. And so that's one of the things that AI and faith is trying to develop, right? So across religions, but of course, it's not just about religious ethics, it's about any kind of ethic, right? So I do think a kind of genuinely pluralistic conversation is necessary. Yet that also makes things incredibly difficult because sometimes we come to kind of impasses about, what is the meaning of human life and at what point does a human life become a human life and what's sacred and all those kind of things, right? So it's not easy. So I guess for the ethics question, broader the better, more pluralistic the better, yet that's going to come with problems. So that's kind of one little inadequate but kind of like overview of my perspective on that. The other thing is, as I'm learning a little bit more, I do feel like regulation in practice, like regulation of AI is really important. And I'm alarmed what's happening now, particularly in the US, like the rolling back of a lot of those initiatives around regulation. Like in the Biden administration, they drafted a AI Bill of Rights, which I think was like a really great start, and forcing people to think about this. And now that's just literally been archived. I think that's deeply problematic. We just have to have some guardrails. And without them, you can already see how those who are powerful, those who create the algorithms, those who have access to big tech companies, have access to our data, they can just completely consistently reinforcing their power without some kind of guardrails on that could become really problematic, even more problematic than it is now, and it's already problematic. So I guess this is a real I don't know answer. It's kind of like watch this space, help me figure this out. Everybody come, let's figure this out.
But that's the question for all of us right now.
Absolutely. Yeah, so I guess I'm putting out there into the world like, hey everybody, what do you think? We've got to look at this. How are we going to talk about this? So, but it's a really important question. It's probably like the question, actually.
Agreed. Well, I'm glad that you're asking it.
Well, I'm asking it. I wish I could go up with some answers, but it's going to be a communal project, that's for sure.
Yeah, for sure. Well, Jane, it was so lovely to chat with you. Thank you so much. Is there anything else that you'd like to mention?
I'm just really happy that you're doing this. I'm happy we have the space for this to happen.
Likewise.
I think we all have a stake in this, and I hope that you don't have to be an expert in AI or computers, as I can testify from my own experience, to be meaningfully engaged in these conversations. So get talking. Let's get our heads together.
Definitely. If you're a human being, you're already in the mix.
You've got a stake in the game.
You've already got a stake in the game. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Great. Well, thanks so much, Jane. Until next time.
Thank you, Alex. You take care.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. Stay tuned to listen to more recordings and interviews with experts from around the world. In the meantime, follow and rate our podcast on your favorite podcast platform and share with your friends. Don't forget to follow us on our social media as well. We're on LinkedIn, X, and Blue Sky. Thank you for joining us today.